It's that time of week again, folks. This is me, your host, Richard McColl, 2,600 meters closer to the stars. And this is episode 517 of the Colombia Calling podcast. Well, for you loyal listeners out there, you know I'm actually not Richard McColl, but I have something even better. I'm Eric Tabone, and my guest this week is yours truly, Richard McColl. I so happen to be the president of the Richard McColl fan club, so it is my absolute honor and pleasure to have this time to get to chat with Richard. Richard, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Oh, thank you for hosting. I was unaware that there's a Richard McColl fan club, but maybe I could make an appearance at one of your conventions.
Conventions, we have a total of one member right now, so anybody else who wants to join, there are membership dues that go directly to my bank account. Just let me know.
Okay, well, that's right. You're about to get a daughter into school, so we need all donations.
There we go. Richard, thanks so much for connecting with us. Everybody knows you, but a lot of people don't know a bit about behind you, how you got to where you are. You know, I, for one, we've been friends for, 14 years, 13 years, something like that.
Something like that. Yeah.
And everything you've done, everything you've always told me, I've always been amazed by and in awe by. So I'm very excited to kind of dive in a bit about who you are and how did you get to here today. So with that, let's get going. Richard, for people who don't know about you, give them a quick introduction and let's talk a bit about where you're from and those first kind of formative years growing up.
Incredibly flattering, Eric. Incredibly flattering to be here as a guest on my own podcast and to be heralded in such a way. No, born and raised in London, but with lots of travel elsewhere. My father was from Canada, from Winnipeg, no less. But he moved over in the 1970s to England because he was an oil man.
Why? Okay. Cool.
He was exploiting the North Sea. He was a geophysicist. And then he met my mum. My mum had she was from northeast London. She was a Cockney, although I didn't know that until later.
What is a Cockney for people who aren't British?
East London, and they talk a bit like this.
Okay.
But so she did she moved to Los Angeles when she was 18 and did elocution lessons to change her accent.
Okay.
There you go. So when she came back after many scrapes and misadventures, she moved to West London, and that's where I was born. So with this plummy accent. But that said, my mother, she opened her own secretarial business in the 70s in London. Okay. And the day that she was meant to send a secretary to my dad's office, the secretary called in sick. So my mum went.
Right.
And stepped in, and the rest is history. The rest is history. Anyway, I grew up in London. My mother absolutely loved Mexico, hitchhiked through it in the 60s, 70s, I think it was. My dad lived in Brazil for about a decade.
And that was before you were born?
Oh, these were both before I was born. Okay. He had his first family, Canadian family. Some of them were born there. And my stepmom, who's originally from Ohio, lived also for about 6 years in Sao Paulo. So let's just say the Latin America bug was very much.
And did you grow up going back to Winnipeg quite a bit?
I've never been to Winnipeg in my life.
You've never been to Winnipeg?
I've never been. It is on my bucket list, in truth, just to see something of the history of it, because I want to go up and see the polar bears, which are further north, up to a place called Churchill. But my dad had moved west, actually aged 14 or 13. They moved west out to Victoria because my grandfather, of course, very old, he was pensioned off by the Canadian Pacific Railways after World War One. And he had problems with his lungs because of the mustard gas in the trenches. And so they moved him from Winnipeg, not so good for your health, Victoria, much better.
There we go. That makes sense. So then you grew up in London. Tell me about where did you go to university? Tell me a bit about your education and what did you choose and why?
Why? Well, I went down to the southwest of England. So if any of you know England, Devon. So it's the county next door to Cornwall, which is in the end, sort of like that end bit of England. Okay. I didn't know a lot about it. When I went and saw the university, good university, still told one of the top 10 in the UK. It was a sunny day, and I was shown around by a pretty girl. And
Spanish.
that was enough.
There you go.
And I did French and Spanish, sort of humanities and literature, because that's what I was good at. And that's, I just want to sort of cruise through. But obviously doing humanities, literature and language actually isn't as easy as it sounds.
Did you already speak a bit of French and Spanish before?
Oh, yeah. I studied them at school. Oh, yeah.
Okay. So
through.
you were decent at that.
Oh, yeah. And then it became very much not fluent, but very good. I spent my third year abroad in Guatemala.
Okay.
And that was cool.
I spent, languages for some people are very easy, and for others they're very difficult. And I'm in that category of very difficult.
All right.
And so the only class I ever failed in my entire life was actually Spanish, and I actually failed it twice. And there were several reasons why. Number one, I just wasn't smart enough to learn it. But then number two, I also thought, here's the ironic part, I also thought I would never be using Spanish in my life after university. Turns out that Spanish is the only class or subject matter I'm actually using that I learned at university today.
But this is the thing. I need to jump in there and turn this around. As you grew up in Texas and California. The Spanish is, a significant language.
It is, but the way we look at that, like when you think of Texas, it is a significant language, but people who speak Spanish also speak English. And then, so I really never had the need, and I grew up in suburbia. Yeah. So I wasn't as exposed to it as it makes it sound, but yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I jumped in and turned the tables there.
And so then I'm going to turn the tables back on you. So you were in Guatemala, you said. Where did you do your study abroad in Guatemala?
No, I didn't study. I was a teacher in a private school. So basically, like American school here, or what do you call it, the Colegio Nueva Granada, I was the substitute teacher in the equivalent in Guatemala City. It was called the Inter-American School, and it was one of the most formative years of my life. And actually, saying that, 25 years after leaving that, I went and met one of my former students in a cafe in Bogota who's living here. We hadn't seen one another in 25 years. And what's the first thing he says when he walks in? Wow, you got old.
Well, that's what happens after 25 years. And so how old were you when you lived in when this time was in Guatemala, and what
20.
year was that?
Well, so it's more than that. So I was 21 or 22. 22 I was. 22, okay. So that's why. But imagine 95? This. It was 98, 99. Yeah, 98. So that was the year of Hurricane Mitch. So I lived through that, which, set Central America back about 10 years because of that. Yep. The Volcan Pacaya, or Fuego, erupted several times, leaving ash all over our houses. Okay. I was in a huge car crash, but it was on New Year's Eve. But I was the one it was a taxi going home on New Year's Eve, but was fine. I was jumped by a gang at the beach, but managed to fight them off. I don't know. I had so many scrapes, and yet I still kept coming back.
And how long were you in Guatemala for? How long was that?
Just a year.
Just a year.
Just a year. All of these things.
How was Guatemala in the late 90s? I went there around 2008, 2009, and I loved it. But 10-year difference is...
Well, it was 2 years out of a peace accord, so it was still a sort of stumbling forwards. A lot of mistrust around. I mean, you could see the rampant corruption. It wasn't safe, let's say, but at the same time, I lived in Guatemala City, which most people avoid, and I had the best time. And actually, I had two Canadian housemates who both worked in schools, but one of them is like my sister to this day. She's moved around the world, and it's just one of those friendships born out of hardship, an emotional hardship.
That's great. Go ahead.
No, I just say I loved it. I absolutely loved it.
I was going to say, Guatemala is one of the most magical countries I've traveled in, and I spent about 5 or 6 weeks there years ago, and it was just the people, the culture, everything about it is amazing. So
it's so rich in culture. It's so fascinating. I've only been back once, and I really want to take my family up there, but it's the flight costs from Colombia to Guatemala are ridiculously expensive.
Completely. Completely, yeah. It's just you'd have to probably go through Miami, Guatemala
Well,
City,
no,
or
you can go on the Central American bus, the one that goes, Avianca Taca up through El Salvador and stuff. But it's still going to work out. It's like almost $600 a person.
Yeah,
You're like, if I'm spending that kind of money, I put it towards flights to London.
Yep, exactly. So you did Guatemala, and then where else? Where did life take you from there?
Well, I went back to England and scraped through my my degree because it was tough to go back, after a year of total independence and all sorts of adventures and everything else. And all of my companions on my course had gone like together to Valencia and Alicante and stuff in Spain, and they'd all just done study programs together. So my best friends, one had been in Argentina, or two had been in Argentina. I was in Guatemala. Another guy was somewhere strange, and so we were actually a lot more mature than the rest of our, we'd lived a little, but I made it. It was absolutely certain that I had to leave England, and I had unfinished business. Let's say I wanted to do more traveling and more time, so I sort of wrote to newspapers in Central America, and one in Costa Rica, an Anglo newspaper which no longer exists. It was called Central America Weekly.
Okay.
And Jose said, "Yeah, we'll take you on as an intern if you want." So I flew out to Guatemala, spent a few weeks there, and just sort of ambled my way down to Costa Rica, where I spent, I don't know, 6 or 8 months interning there, or something like that.
This was 1999. Does that?
No, this will be 2000 to 2000. Yeah, 2000. So I graduated.
You fly down, you get to Guatemala City, you get an internship, and then you make your way to Costa Rica.
Yeah, where the internship is in Costa Rica, yeah.
Great. And so how long were you in Costa Rica? And what was Costa Rica like in 2000?
Yeah, well, you know what? I mean, with no offense to any of my Costa Rican friends, it didn't measure up to Guatemala. Okay. And it didn't measure up to like Nicaragua, because it doesn't have the same, I would say, original culture. Okay. And I was a bit disappointed in that. I did love the nature and everything else, but I found it quite pricey as well, because it had been, a US and European haunt already for a while, very carefully marketed on having no army. Right. And so, of course, that is a great marketing campaign. When you look at Central America and all of the different troubles that have taken place and all of the news out of the 80s and 90s, the gangs, the civil wars, and Costa Rica's there going, "Oh, we don't have an army." Right. So I did find it not great value for money. I spent 6 to 8 months.
Costa Rica is very expensive. Yeah. Yeah. 20 years ago it was expensive, and even today, even more so.
Yeah, and so I mean, but don't get me wrong, I had great times. My first ever job as an intern was to interview the vice president of Costa Rica.
Oh, that's cool.
Which was pretty cool. I don't even remember anything about the interview. I remember I didn't think I even had like an ironed shirt, and it's just like a crumpled student turned up. But then the second job, which was by far the best, was I was sent to review the Miss Costa Rica finals. And it's live on television, and it's a big deal, and it was held in the Museum of the Child, or Children Museum, which used to be a prison, like so many museums in Latin America.
In Latin America, yeah.
And it's live on prison, so we had to pause midway through events for advertising. Okay. And I just found myself laughing a lot, because you know how it is. I've been to two of these pageants, one in Colombia, one in Costa Rica. I can get onto the Colombia one at another later moment, but the Costa Rica one is when you realize the difficult questions round, and they all said, who's your role model? God, and I was just like, come on, man. And I was like, fair enough. I mean, fair enough. If that's your thing, they also that. And then when we would break after the swimwear round, which is just kind of vile, because there's a whole load of men just leching over them. Right. After the swimwear round, we break for advertising, so it's put up on the screen. Obviously, none of these things can run without advertising, TV advertising. But the first publicity that came up was for condoms. And I just thought, someone has thought this through.
That's awesome. That's hilarious looking back. So how you were in Costa Rica for about how long more or less from
6
Costa
to 8
Rica?
months or so. And I thought, you know what? I've had enough. So I bought a flight to Brazil.
Okay. And so this in Costa Rica, this was kind of like your first foot into journalism to an extent.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And did you know you're going to work in journalism before this, or was this just the first opportunity that you were offered and you took it?
Well, I think I always had an idea that I wanted to be in something reasonably creative. And I wanted to at least use, I always say that undergraduate, and especially in arts undergraduate, humanities, is to teach you how to think. And I just thought, yeah, I've got so much literary knowledge and all this other stuff, but that you can go into something like journalism as opposed to studying journalism, which I don't recommend to anyone as an undergraduate, because you haven't learned how to think and you haven't found your interests.
Right.
And a lot of my interest then came from actually learning so much more about the civil conflicts in Central America. So that's why I wanted to be there. And I started getting interested in politics and just the nature of it, because we don't get taught any of it in England. It's not our sphere of influence. You get basically the old empire is what you're taught about.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was the same to my education. We, in the United States, obviously I'm from Texas, grew up there, but we didn't learn any Latin American history, anything about conflict. We learned, the empire, to an extent, the British Empire and the history of that. Had history of Texas, which I find very interesting, which
it is
history
interesting.
books. It's very interesting, but the history of Texas has also been created to map the story they want to portray, which isn't always accurate, which is really even more interesting. But yeah, so I mean, I understand exactly what you're saying. Like oftentimes, Latin America conflict, all that stuff, it's a bit overlooked, especially in undergrad.
Yeah, for us, because we didn't get much. We had North American studies. Of course, we all before around the age of 13, 14 was the what would you call it, settlement of whereas in the United States, the wars against the French, and then there's sort of you call it the Great Revolutionary War, and we call it something else, and those things. And then we have sort of we all studied sort of, let's say, the exploration of the New World, which is as in Cortez to Mexico. But then in Mexico,
I didn't even get that.
Down south, as far as there's a huge gap until we get to Peru, and we learn about, like, so let's say the Incas a bit, but it was always from the perspective of the conquistadors, Pizarro and so on. So so I felt that there was a gap, and I absolutely devoured the history and the politics of it all.
That's great. Well, so this jump into Brazil, because we still have a lot of ground to cover. So you get to Brazil,
got a lot of ground.
And if I remember correctly, this is going to be when you started to also start guiding, doing tour guiding.
There's a huge amount that happened before then. No, I spent about a year around Latin America, so I covered pretty much everything, and I was in the Amazon, having traveled up the Brazilian Amazon up into Iquitos, having been accused of murder on the boat, which was another story.
Tell us about that, because that sounds like a good detour.
I was I was the number one suspect for a murder, because basically when you're on those boats, the transport boats, and this is again back in 2000, and it's now 2001, you're just in a hammock, right, with everybody else.
Right.
And on the first or second night, I woke up because I heard something, scraping underneath my hammock and rustling, and it was one of the boys who worked in the engine room was trying to rob my stuff. But it was so pitch black darkness, and you can imagine sort of mid-river up the Amazon, no light, all the lights are turned off to sleep, nothing. So I can't tell who it is, but I just start shouting, and everybody else starts shouting, and this guy just runs off. Again, I couldn't identify him. Even if you forced me at gunpoint, I wouldn't be able to identify him. Anyway, the next day we docked at a small town, and you know what happens in these it's basically piracy up the river here. The guys that work the boat really get drunk, probably go to a brothel and stuff, and come back on the top deck and gamble. Anyway, midway through, it must have been 2 a.m, there was a splash, and it was a man went overboard. Of course, stop. in the dark in the jungle. You have to go to the next stop point. Anyway, so apparently the worker, he died. He went over and drowned. And of course, who had motive? Yeah, motive was me. So I was questioned for quite a long time in a Brazilian police checkpoint along the Amazon River.
Oh, wow. And how did they figure out how he went over?
I think it was just drunkenness. I think it was really, I mean, because people get absolutely, it's not like happy drunk. It's just drunk to fight, drunk to stuff.
Okay.
Wow. Yeah, that was hard. But then we got to Peru, and I was around, I was in the jungle in Peru and stuff, and I was just like, I've still got time because this is early in the year. Yeah, it's in the earlier months of the year. Still got time to travel a lot, and I'm going to do as much as I can. But I'm going to need to formalize my life a little bit. I can't just be a vagabond. I applied for a master's in international journalism with international relations at the University of London and was accepted.
Okay, great.
So I had from like March till September to travel, and then went back to do that for a year.
Wonderful. And then after that, when you finished your master's, how did you get back to Latin America?
Well, I did little jobs, sort of intern, but paid internships. I worked for the Independent in London. I worked for Newsweek in London. I worked for the Daily Telegraph in London, although I walked out after 2 weeks because I was on the social pages.
Okay.
Worst reporting ever. This is staying up all night and being told you have to go to a club to look for Paris Hilton to see if she's done something. It's the worst. And they say, the runner-up in Big Brother 7 is going to be there. And I'm like, I don't even know who that is, So then I fell into a job with the environmental NGO WWF, not the rest. And they sent me to Colombia.
Great. And what year was this when you came back?
This is 98, and I was sent to the Pacific Coast for a few weeks to travel from Bahia Malaga down to Buenaventura, checking out the projects to preserve the mangroves and the people living there. And I don't know, man, it was the second time I'd been to Colombia. Oh, this wasn't 98, this is later, it's 2001 or 2002.
After you had finished your master's, correct?
Yeah, so I was there in 2002, and it was something. I was only on the Pacific Coast. I was only there for a few weeks, and I loved it. And it was just there. And then after that, I said, I don't want to be in a desk job anymore in London. So I quit, went to New York to clear my head for a couple of months. That was fun. Very nearly got a job with National Geographic, but couldn't get a visa. And then essentially to skip a lot of stuff, got the job as a guide and social projects coordinator for a company in the UK, and this would allow me to travel and write freelance, but also earning in pounds whilst doing jobs.
What was the company?
It was called Quest Overseas. It doesn't. I don't know. I don't really think it exists anymore because we did a lot of gap year stuff. So.
Okay. I remember. I think as when I was in high school, I did something with Quest Overseas. I believe. I can't remember exactly, but that's why I was asking. So how many trips did you do? What was the guiding lifestyle like for?
Well, I was there for a few years, because I would do 3-month jobs and then be off for 3 months. So it was fun for me because I'd be like, okay, well, I want to go here now, and right now to go about this, I'll do that, and then I'll be back. So I worked in the Ecuadorian Amazon, on a sustainable sort of farming project, and I guided for a few weeks. I don't know how many times I've done the Inca Trail because I didn't have so many times in these groups, which is cool. Of course, I love it. And then I also ran a project with disabled orphans in the the favela, Mangueira favela in Rio.
That had to be challenging.
It was an experience. That was the time when I was walking up through with my group. We were about 20, I think. I was sort of at the back, walking them up through the favela because we were known. We would be known to looking after the children, so we got free passage in this favela. And one guy said, "Oh, we got a market up here," and I was like, oh, "Great, we can get some fruit and vegetables and whatever for our to cook." And he was like, "No, for drugs and guns." I was like, "Oh, okay, perhaps we'll go the other way around." And we were walking up one of those, those images of really narrow sort of corridors between these houses. I was going up one, and there were a bunch of kids, just like out of City of God, standing there, just in shorts and Havaianas. And one of them shoved a gun in my stomach and went, "So who's going to win the World Cup?" And I was like, "Well, Brazil." And like he went, "Yeah, okay."
Oh, wow. And was it a loaded gun? Were you scared at the time? Or
well, I don't know. It was a loaded gun. It was a gun's a gun for me. I mean,
yeah.
I'm not.
Oh, wow.
That was one of those. And then, long story short, I was there. I worked in Peru. I worked in Ecuador. I worked in Bolivia. I worked in Brazil. And then in my off time, I spent a lot of time in Chile, Uruguay, and Argentina. And then, it was gone. England was gone, at that time.
And so with that, how did you end up settling in Colombia, and what kind of brought you here? Tell me a bit about that.
So I got very sick in Brazil.
Okay.
I got
dengue,
right? And malaria at the same time.
Congrats.
In rural Brazil, and my life was saved by a Cuban doctor called Dr. Lenin. I recovered. Went up through the Guyanas. A girl that I grew up with in England is a red-headed Irish girl, is now married to a guy in French Guyana, so I spent some time with her.
Great, small world.
Yeah, Guyana. Then went up and skipped over Venezuela and came to Colombia. And in Colombia, in Santa Marta, I got dengue again, and I got hemorrhagic dengue this time. And
oh, wow.
That brought up the malaria the second time because it's hammering your, your defenses. So I was in Santa Marta and I went, no, you know what? I'm getting on a plane to Medellin right now.
What year was this? More or less 2009?
No, much before that. I was not yet 40. No, not yet 30. Whoops. I was not yet 30. So I almost didn't live to see 30.
Oh, wow.
And I went because I knew that there was a very good sort of tropical medicine, hospital there. And I went to the Clínica Rosario, and a doctor his name I will never forget is Dr. Ana Maria Gomez Chvatal. I think her parents or grandparents were Czech or something. She had spent time in her rural, that Colombians, when they do medicine or dentistry or stuff, spend some months out in the wilds there. She had spent in a red zone where the guerrillas had come to her always for medicines. And they tried to take her off she told me all about this. They tried to take her to their camp to attend to people. And she's like, I can't do that, but you can come here with the symptoms or bring your guys here. And they were like, no, we can't do that either. But he was like, come here, give me the symptoms, and I'll send you the creams and diagnose and stuff.
Wow.
Anyway, so she had seen a lot of tropical diseases, and I was in there for several weeks. Horrible experience. But at the end, she said, promise me you'll leave the tropics. And she said, one of the times I was in a delusional state, and I woke up and there's a priest praying at the foot of my bed. My son, are you a Catholic? And I'm like, whatever it takes, Father. Anyway, I get better, but I flipped out at that moment. I flipped out because no one was telling me anything, and I'm all alone.
Right.
And finally, they came in and said, listen, we're very worried about you. We are very, very worried. And at the end, you stayed just above the limit we needed to give you a full blood transfusion.
Oh, wow.
So I was like, whoa. Anyway, they were like, stay calm and promise us you'll leave the tropics. You may be the unluckiest man alive, but you're alive. And I've never. Wow. So I flew to Chile.
Got out of the tropics, and so that's kind of when you hung up your guide hats.
Yeah. I actually was called in an emergency for the company once more. Several years later, they had one of their guides, got sick or broke a leg or something, and they were like, "Well, we've got Richard out there, and he's in Colombia. We can just fly him down to Bolivia, and it'll be a lot easier." So I did it quickly then, but it was.
It was only 8 weeks. It wasn't in the tropics in Bolivia.
No, it was just Bolivia. It was just highlands and so on. But I was, and I decided that where did I want to be? I wanted to be in Colombia. So it was a question of getting better. It was a question of getting my visa. I got a visa to be a journalist in Colombia.
And what year was this?
I moved full time in 2007.
2007.
Full time.
I don't know
Yeah.
many journalists who were craving to get a journalistic visa in Colombia in 2007.
It was not easy, but I was able to show articles on who I was.
Okay.
And I don't know, I guess I got the consul somewhere. I don't even remember where, but I guess I got the consul on a good day, because this is the Uribe years, and they're not very friendly to journalists.
To journalists, and it wasn't too safe for journalists at that time. Well, even now sometimes, but
I promised my dad, who was still alive at the time, I promised my dad, he said, because he knew Latin America, having been in Brazil for a long time, having worked in Nicaragua and been like sort of, he had trouble with I think it was Aleman, the president, at one point and stuff. But, you know, he'd been in scrapes in Angola and elsewhere. And he was just like, please promise me you'll not do politics. And so I didn't really do politics to begin with. I did a lot of culture. I did a lot of travel stuff because I had the contacts. But I got really bored of it. I mean, really bored of it. And you know, sadly, he passed away. And as soon as he passed away, I moved into politics and conflict.
Politics.
Yeah.
There we go. So obviously, I know you from your journalistic pursuits, and you've been doing this for, like you said, since last, almost 20 years just in Colombia.
Yeah.
But you also have quite a few interesting business ventures. So talk to me a bit about that. How did you get into the Mom Post? Tell me your back end story. How'd you get in, and how are you now the dawn of Mom Post?
Dawn. I had actually read about Mom Post during my undergraduate in Exeter in Devon.
Okay.
Because when you do this sort of, let's say, the colonization of the New World, the Magdalena River comes up. And I'd read about this beautiful colonial town. And I've been to many, many colonial towns through Latin America. And I was like, this is one of the last I don't know. And I wanted to go there for Easter. I was already seeing my then girlfriend, who's now my wife, Alba. And I said, listen, I'm going to go to Monpos for Semana Santa. This is 2007. She's like, my maternal family's from there. It was total chance. Total chance. And I was like, well, okay. Well, I mean, you know, I'll go and they'll help me find a place to stay and everything else. And I was there and I was just like, this is the most incredible place. Okay. This really is. There is so much potential here. And in Semana Santa, which was the high season, the actual, you know, the big tourism season, there were only 2 foreigners. Myself, I was writing an article for the South American Explorers magazine or something. And the other guy was an Englishman who actually we had friends in common in England, who was writing the footprint guide. And of course, we gravitated to one another. And we were like, we talked about it. I mean, he's now like the Reuters correspondent in Spain or something. I mean, he's gone on to great things. But he said, you know, why do people not come here? And we realized it was the lack of communication, it's just a lack of actual information about the place. And I was like, I can do that. And I just said, well, you know, everything's so cheap. I'd like to buy a house, set it up, and have a project. And really, I told my future mother-in-law this, and I didn't really think anything of it. I thought, well, you know, 6 months, 8 months, she might come back. Within a week, she said, oh, well, you know, and of course, her doing the negotiations as a Momposina means that things are better. They knew it was going to a gringo. We bought it, but we didn't know that there were 36 or 38 heirs to the property, because the lady who owned the property, Ana Leonor, had died 8 years previously, and the house had been sort of left to ruin. Okay. And she'd never had children. And so we're looking at nephews and cousins and great nephews and stuff. And this flow chart, if you had seen how we had to do it, we had to bust some people in from like the Guajira, and they were only getting, their share was like 250,000 pesos, but they were on time, so they'd do it, a free bus ticket. You know, it's like no one had been able to do this. And
you had to bring everybody in to get all 36, 38 signatures.
Yeah. And the last one doesn't.
This was 2008 when you purchased it? When it came
end of 2007.
Into 2007.
And well, no, actually midway 2007. And then, you know, the last person to come up and sign and goes, I'm not going to sign. And so you have to pay them more money. You sort of double it. But again, like 500,000 pesos is not going to break the bank. But it was like the Wild West. We had the room in the back of the bank. and a stack of cash
That's
on the
cool.
desk. I wish I had a photo. I don't.
That's what I was about to ask. That's what
I
was
wish I
about
had a
to
photo. We had, each person came forward with their cellular, their ID card, and you were like, "Who are you?" You check it. Okay, you're due this. And
so this was the beginning of Casa Amarillo. Is that correct?
Yeah, we opened in March 2008.
Okay, so you did
with
a
only 4
renovation.
rooms. Yeah.
Within 3 months, you were able to get it functioning.
Well, the 4 rooms were easy to sort of polish up. It was basic, but it was 4 rooms because we'd only got one side, and now the other side had been bought because years previously, this family couldn't decide how they were going to divide the inheritance. So one side took half of the house, and the other side took the other half of the house, and they built a wall down the middle.
Okay.
So I had to buy the other side of the house. Fortunately, or unfortunately, however you look at it, the man who lived in the house alongside had been swindling money from his job, and either he had to pay them back. It was found out that what he'd been doing over years, either pay them back, end up in the river, or flee to Venezuela.
So you're able to
it's still Wild West. Still Wild West out there. Anyway, he was of the white upper class, so like descendants from the conquistadors. So he couldn't lose face by public negotiation. We had to do all negotiations at night under the cover of darkness.
Wow. So you get this, you're launching your project in 2008, and let's fast forward to today. Now you have 2 hotels in Mompos. What? Now you have 2 hotels in Mompos. You also have your own house in Mompos. So how did you go from one place until now owning 3 properties and bringing a lot of tourism and industry to the city or town?
It's a good story because it was, first of all and foremost, everyone thinks I'm laundering dollars, and it's all the gossip behind me is I'm laundering dollars, and I send the gossip back going, if I wanted to launder dollars, I'd do it somewhere like Barranquilla where there's an actual flow of dollars.
Exactly.
We never really, until pandemic, of course, I don't want to talk about that. We never turned a loss. There were always backpackers coming through at the beginning. And then, then we went upgrading to mid-range and then upper mid-range with Casa Maria. And we realized we had the platform for a top end place now. We had enough people to need a top end place. And we'd bought this house. We ended up buying the next house, which again, you'll have to buy my book to hear all the ins and outs of that one. And we'll get into that in a second. That was hard. At one point, I gave up. I paid the deposit, the security deposit to buy the house, and hadn't heard anything in more than 2 years. And one night I went to bed going, that money's just lost. I've got to just bite the bullet. And the next day, the paperwork came through. I mean, it was one of those things at that house, but we didn't renovate what is now San Rafael first because it was such a huge job. It was a question of getting money together. We were sitting, me, my wife, and my mother-in-law was sitting in the main plaza enjoying a cold drink there, and me and my wife were saying, we have an apartment in the Casa Maria, but it's becoming a bit tiresome because guests come and look for you at all times. And if they can't find you, they'll see you on your balcony, so they'll walk out into the cloistered garden and wave at you and say, one more question. You're like, you've sucked me dry of information all day long.
Right.
Post 8 o'clock, I'm not expecting to give you more transport information.
Right.
So we said, we would really like, our own place. And my mother-in-law says, that house over there on the main square, I think it's secretly for sale. And I was like, well, could you find out? And it turned out, the guy who owned it, he lived in El Banco Magdalena, which is over the other side. His wife had died and she'd loved the house, but it was now time to sell because it all but her brother was living as a hermit in one of the rooms.
Oh, wow.
He didn't want to sell because it would mean he'd lose his house because he was living there in grace and favor. So he kept taking the sign down. So we actually bought a house that legitimately wasn't on the market. And again, I can't remember what year exactly now. It's more than 10 years now, I think. But the houses were still so cheap because Colombia, the tourism boom hadn't happened.
Right.
Nobody believed in Mompos. Everyone thought I was mad. What's this gringo doing now? But we bought it. renovated. Now we've got this wonderful four-room house overlooking the main plaza in Monpós. Then we restored the other one, which is now the top hotel in town, the San Rafael. We've only got, between the two hotels, 17 rooms. These are not big places.
Right.
Running and caring for colonial houses in the tropics is not an easy task.
No, not at all. Not at all. That's amazing. That's amazing. Well, so while we're on Bombos, Richard, tell me, I know you have a new book about to come out. So let's do a quick pitch on your new book.
Actually, it's quite exciting. I've got a designer working on the cover, so that's quite exciting.
Well, tell everybody quickly what's coming out. When do you expect to get it? And just give us a quick glimpse on what to expect.
Well, it's called The Monpós Project, a story of love, hotels, and madness in Colombia.
Love it.
My catch line. The issue is, I started writing it more than 10 years ago, and just writing down some of the more curious things that happened: witchcraft, ghost stories, errant donkeys, and so on, and some of the history. And then I decided, you know what? Because the reality is, after a few years in Colombia, my life came to an impasse where I no longer wanted to write about tourism and stuff, and blue plate specials in restaurants and so on. And there was something that happened, and I can't remember exactly what it was. Something nefarious in the conflict happened, some kidnapping or assassination, that I was so upset by it. I was like, I can't do this anymore. Right. And so I started to incorporate in the writing, putting what was going on in Colombia at the time, but in its context with Monpós. And so the first thing that I then slide in is the reality of this small rural town, on the Magdalena River, beautiful colonial UNESCO World Heritage Site, the day that Ingrid Betancourt was freed in Operación Jaque, checkmate. Mm-hmm. Nobody cared. Yeah, it didn't mean anything to these people. Right. And you start realizing that Colombia is, amalgamation of several countries. And the guys who sit in the beer kiosk in front of the Casa Maria playing dominoes, doing nothing all day, nice. Right. You've got them. All I heard, I was alone in the Casa Maria running it. Everyone else had gone out on the boat trip, all the guests. And I went, and I overheard them say, "Oh yeah, the white lady's been freed. La Mona."
There's no, yeah.
And I was like, God, that must mean something. So I switched on the TV, and of course it's, channel, it's page to page, everything. And I was like, look at this. You go to Bogota or Medellin. This is the biggest thing ever in Paris. But in these rural communities, and I was just like, what? I start putting these things in because it's a greater explanation of Colombia.
That's great.
And I put them in, and I'd just been finishing up like a professional MA, so I didn't have to do a thesis, in conflict resolution here in Bogota. And so my knowledge of the conflict and then latterly the peace accords were very, very up to date. And right. I actually got a prize for best student. It's like the first time ever. It wasn't for best behavior; it was for academic work. Let's just say.
Right.
But the stories out of Monpós keep coming. When we restored our house, here's one of the things: we had to dig up the garden to put some new electrical wires in, and one of the sort of elder members of one of the top families, I would say, the conquistador families in Monpós, came out and said, "Did you find anything down there where you dug?" I'm like, "No, we didn't find anything." He said, "Oh yeah, my cousin died a few days after being born. He was buried there."
Okay.
Right. We didn't find any bones. Thank you. It's like, okay. But it becomes
all these stories coming together.
And it becomes like, the daily chat. It's things like, right. My wife. The most recent story is we wanted to buy 6 clay pots from alfarero, clay maker, who lives far out of Monpós, and he wouldn't do the commission of making the pots because he said he'd quedar mal. He didn't want to be in bad business with us and stuff. Anyway, he then decides that he does want to do it. A month later, he doesn't have our number, so he calls a number in Monpós, and there's a security guard. It's like the Casa de la Cultura. He speaks to the security guard and goes, "Yeah, there was a lady. I don't remember her name, but she lives close by, and her daughter's beautiful, and they want pots." Her daughter's beautiful, and they live in Bogota, And the guy went, I think you're talking about Esther. That's my mother-in-law. And yes, her daughter's beautiful, and they do live in Bogota. So the security guard came round and knocked on our door to say, yeah, does your daughter live in Bogota? Because she's beautiful and the claymaker's looking for her.
That's great. So it's bringing all these stories and everything you've done from Mompost into a book. So when's this going to come out, and where can people get this?
Well, it will be out second half of the year. I'm just printing at the moment like a reference book on Colombian politics and history called the Colombia at a Crossroads. It's a historical and social biographies that covers all of Colombia's politics and history and some of the society. So that one will be out in a couple of weeks or a week or so. It's with the printers now. So the Mompost project is going through its final edits. It's with a designer. I hope second half of this year. So within a couple of months, I should be already talking to the printers. It will be obviously on Amazon, ebook and print on demand, but it will be printed here in Bogota. And excitingly, I am in conversations with a distributor in England to distribute the books that we start producing. Most importantly, I'm not going to be like Liz Truss and hold up the book upside down.
Better Than Cocaine.
Better Than Cocaine, Learning to Grow Coffee and Live in Colombia by Barry Max Wills. It's the first work of nonfiction that me and Alba, my wife, published with our little editorial company called Fuller Vigil, and it's selling well.
Wonderful. Yeah. Well, Richard, that's great. And I, for one, I cannot wait for these.
You were like the best client. I don't know how many you've bought.
I've bought a lot. I have my little frequent flyers club for your books. So, Richard, we're starting to wrap up for time. We're going to do a quick lightning round. I have a couple quick questions we're going to go through. These are quick answers. So let's go. So, favorite restaurant in Bogota?
Mesa Franca.
Mesa Franca. Your favorite book?
It's usually what I'm reading at the time, but one that I go back to a lot. I do love Heart of Darkness, Joseph Conrad, that I go back to a lot. But People of the Abyss by The Road to Wigan Pier by George Orwell.
Okay, great. Best book on Colombia?
Quite a lot. If you want a history one, the best one, of course, is David Bushnell's Colombia, A Nation in Spite of Itself. Fiction on Colombia. No. What I've always liked non-fiction. I've always liked The Fruit Palace by Charles Nicholl.
Okay.
Good one, of course, is Tom Feiling's Short Walks from Bogota.
You're missing one of my favorite Colombia books, Magdalena.
Oh, Wade Davis, Magdalena. Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
I kind of don't think of him as like, I think of obviously Colombia, but I always think of him. I always think of the Amazon.
Yeah, he does that. Best story you have ever reported on?
Ooh, I don't know. There's been a few weird ones. It would have to be quirky. Although, if I talk about the Colombia Calling podcast, recently the podcast with Gary Murray, where he was a hotelier in Bogota and all the scrapes he went through, I got a great message from a friend at the university, Birmingham City University, who works in tourism education, who said, I started listening to this podcast. I thought, there'll be stuff there that I can use in my lectures. So we start on tourism, and then suddenly there's money laundering, and then there's infidelity, and then there's this, and there's that. He goes, I can't use this, but this interview has everything, and it's just phenomenal. Well done.
Great. Favorite cocktail?
Not really a cocktail man. I just prefer a single malt. Don't like sweet drinks.
All right. Worst Colombian food?
Oh yeah, changua would be up there.
Horrible stuff. It's pretty bad.
Yeah.
Favorite podcast guest up until now?
Well, it depends of fame and so on. Wade Davis is going to be up there definitely, and that was a huge coup for me to get someone like Wade Davis.
Wade Davis, and for those listening, if you haven't listened to that, go back and listen to that. Still one of the best podcasts of all times.
Yeah, we've re-released it. We re-released it last year as well because it's still topical.
All right. Who's your favorite child?
Neither. I love them equally. Thank you for that.
Favorite Colombian president, dead or alive?
Dead or alive? That's a very good question. Let's just take out the last 5. Out of the last,
Okay.
out of Petro, Duque, Santos, Uribe, and Pastrana, I'll take Santos.
Santos, great. Favorite British monarch, dead or alive?
Favorite British monarch? Only because probably, you think of Henry V out of the Shakespeare play and so on. Probably him.
And last one to wrap it up. What do you want to be remembered for?
Humility would be nice.
Great.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, Richard, thank you so much. It's been an absolute delight. For everyone out there, thank you. This is for the Colombian podcast. I'm not your host, Richard McColl, but it has been an absolute pleasure getting to know a bit more behind the curtain of our glorious Richard McColl. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you, Eric.